This is Ranger Kidwell-Ross, editor of worldsweeper.com, and I have with me Mike Trojan. And Mike is with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. For about 30 years, he has been involved in pushing the needle for water quality, stormwater pollution abatement, and those kinds of topics. And he is also a principal in the new study that has come out, a relatively new study out of Minnesota, and it is including credits for sweeping phosphorus. The study showed that phosphorus can be handled by a street sweeper for as little as approaching $100 a pound. And lest you think that sounds expensive, uh, in the Chesapeake Bay area, they're chasing phosphorus at the end of the pipe for many thousands of dollars a pound, in the order of $16,000, $17,000 a pound. So we're going to talk today about how sweeping has been shown through the study to really make a difference in the cost of removing pollutants, specifically phosphorus, and talk about how Minnesota is putting out credits in that regard. And sorry to keep you there in the waiting room, Mike, but if you would give a little bit about your background, and then let's launch into the meat of this, which is the impact of this Minnesota study, please.
Great, thanks, Ranger. So as Ranger mentioned, next April I'll be celebrating my 30th year with the state of Minnesota. About half that time I've worked in the groundwater field, and about 15 years ago I saw the light and moved over to stormwater, and I've been working in stormwater since then. Worked on TMDLs, total maximum daily loads, for a while, and then switched over to developing guidance. So I work a lot with researchers and try to take the research information and technical information and to translate that into tools and resources that practitioners can use, primarily through the Minnesota Stormwater Manual, but through other venues also, such as webinars, videos, training, workshops, and so forth. My background academically is I have a master's in forest hydrology and a doctorate in soils. So hopefully, as Ranger and I discussed previously, that lends some credibility to what I'm about to say, although maybe my family sometimes doesn't agree with that. And I do apologize. There's a little bit of background noise, so you may see the mute button pop up occasionally off and on. But it's just some hammering that some neighbor is doing. So hopefully that won't be too intrusive.
Not so far. And on the topic, just as a quick digression about how that works in the family, when my wife was going for her doctorate, she asked me if I was going to call her doctor. And I said, since I have a master's in economics, I said I'd be glad to if she'd call me master. The subject never came up again. So.
Yeah, I don't, not too many people even know that I have a doctorate, which is kind of the way I like to keep, because then they start expecting things from you.
Well, talk, if you would, Mike, about how the study got started and the results. We have an interview that I'll link with Randy Nieprash, who talked at some extensive amount about how the study worked. But especially, I'm interested in the idea of the credits that state of Minnesota is now developing. And there's an actual, you've hired a company, I believe they're called Tetra Tech, that will be putting the final touches on the way to have cities get their credits, and tell us what their credits about and that sort of thing too, please.
Sure. So I've always worked in water quality, and when I came over to stormwater, I saw some of the initial work that had been done in Wisconsin by Roger Bannerman and some of the stuff coming out of the Chesapeake Bay. And at the time, they were suggesting that street sweeping doesn't do much for water quality. And I scratched my head and I go, well, it has to. Leaves drop in the street, you pick the leaves up, you should be taking some phosphorus out. Well, then we did a study here. There are others, Roger Sutherland, for example, who countered that argument. And we did a study here, not we, but some University of Minnesota researchers did a study in Prior Lake about 6, 8 years ago, and the data they collected started to suggest that, well, if sweeping was done at certain times of the year in certain ways, in fact, would be very beneficial from a water quality standpoint. So I reached out to some researchers at the University of Minnesota who had done that earlier study and said, can we work with some municipalities, some cities, to do a sweeping study? We knew that Bill Selbig from the USGS in Madison, Wisconsin, was doing some research and was starting to find that, in fact, sweeping again done at the right time with the right equipment is very effective. And so we worked. The University of Minnesota did this research. They worked with 6 cities. They collected the data. What we wanted to do was we wanted to get away from empirical formulas, and we wanted to tie a credit to actual material that was being collected. So that would drive. We felt that would drive cities to actually go out and when they swept, measure the material that they were sweeping. And if you get a credit for what you collect, then the more you collect, the more the credit you get. And so that coupled with the work that the U did and Bill Selbig, we developed relationships between the amount of material that's collected either on a wet mass or dry mass basis. We were able to correlate that with phosphorus concentrations. And so now we've got a pretty easy to use Excel spreadsheet. You just go in and all you got to do is weigh your material either as a wet or a dry mass, plug it into this Excel spreadsheet, and it spits you out a number for phosphorus. So you can then take that phosphorus credit, which is in pounds, and if you're a permittee looking for a credit, you can submit that to the agency I work for to comply with water quality permits. We also have watershed districts that have rules regarding phosphorus removal, so they can be used to meet those requirements. And we found that the credits that are offered through this Excel spreadsheet are an order of magnitude higher than what you would get using just simple empirical formulas. So the next step now is to work on 2 things, developing the guidance about when to sweep and how to sweep. And then the second part of that is getting the word out. And so our contractor, Tetra Tech, is getting close to having that guidance done. Once it's done, we'll be putting that in our Minnesota Stormwater Manual and advertising it. But then the tough part, as you and I had talked about, all the science is the easy part. Getting people to actually do things now, that's going to be the tough part. And so they're Tetra Tech, I'm working with them to develop a communication plan. And we have some ideas about how to get the word out, and we can talk about that as part of this interview if you'd like.
Well, I would like, in fact, because that to me is a very central part of this. World Sweeper is the largest information resource for power sweeping on the internet. And so we do have an audience that is not just American, but is around the world. And there's more and more interest. In fact, I responded today to a PhD student that's doing their doctoral dissertation on this exact topic, on phosphorus and the runoff, and how that might differ in China than it is different in the United States. And I send him links and so forth. So um, one of the problems that I have seen through my 30 some years of covering the sweeping industry, when you talk about these things, the people in other cities say, well, I'm not Minnesota, or in the case of Dr. John Sansaloni's work in Florida with the University of Florida, I'm not Florida, we're different. So one of the things I think we're going to have to address is, what do you do if you're in Ohio or New Jersey or someplace, or let's say around the Chesapeake? How can you translate this information that you learned such that they believe that this will be similar in their area? Do they need to do collection studies, sampling, or what can be done so that they believe that this is the actual case?
Yeah, and our credit even though I mentioned that it was an order of magnitude more than what you would get if you're using an empirical model or a wind slam or something like that, it's still fairly conservative in the sense that we didn't take median values, for example, that the University of Minnesota came up with. We took 90th percentile, lower 90th, 10 percentile values because there are some unanswered questions yet. And as a state agency, people don't like it when you give a credit and then 5 years later you say, well, the credit was too high and we have to take some of that back. So there are some unanswered questions. And, is a leaf no matter where it is, for example? And does phosphorus concentration vary from species to species? Does phosphorus react differently in different climates? Is it leached from leaves differently in Minnesota versus Florida versus Ohio? And so those are a couple of the questions I think we still need some answers to. We're always we always want to give the highest credit that we're comfortable with, to our permittees. To some extent, a leaf is a leaf, so the credit approach, the methodology should certainly be applicable, I think, anywhere. The question is, are the relationships between phosphorus and the material collected, are those the same? And so that would be an area where maybe we need to maybe do some more research or whatever.
Mhm. Well, I certainly agree with that. One of the things that is happening out there is that there are municipalities are collecting money, usually based on garbage pickup or some kind of surcharge fees for stormwater pollution abatement. So they have these pockets of money that they're typically using for anything at the end of the pipe, whether it's a catch basin filtration or grassy swales or whatever you want to fill in the blank with. So how do we show them? And the way to illustrate this to me is to say now in Minnesota, someone will look at what it costs to get rid of phosphorus at the end of the pipe, and they'll look at the much less that it costs to get rid of phosphorus via sweeping, and so they should rationally do more sweeping and less at the end of the pipe. It seems like the rational answer here would be to say, well, here's what it costs me to get. It costs me this much money to get rid of a pound of phosphorus at the end of the pipe. It costs this much money to get rid of it now with the sweeper. So obviously, if you swept every day, you wouldn't pick up much material and it would cost you a lot more per pound of phosphorus picked up. If you swept once a year, you'd pick up an enormous amount. So what is the frequency of sweeping? How can we decide what is the frequency of sweeping that where as the frequency increases, then the cost per pound picked up is going to increase. And when the curve crosses where the cost of the sweeping now intersects for picking up the phosphorus, intersects with the initial cost at the end of the pipe, that's when you stop sweeping, stay at that frequency, and move to other end of the pipe solutions. And it seems clear to me that stormwater money should be combined with sweeping department money any place that the environment is important in terms of sweeping stormwater pollution runoff and so forth.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple things there that are interesting. Finding that inflection point is certainly going to be important. And I think there's some data out there. I don't have it at the tip of my finger right now, but there is some data that shows, when sweeping is more efficient. Obviously, it's going to be more efficient when you have more leaf material being deposited in the street in that. But there's a couple other elements to the equation too. One thing that's always been in the back of my head is trying to pull in people who work in different aspects of this issue. You've got the public works people, you've got the water quality people, you've got the urban foresters, and if we could all start kind of communicating, start planning our cities and our tree systems in our cities a little bit differently, so that we know based on what kind of trees we have in certain areas. For example, I have ginkgos on my street, and I know the leaves are going to fall off whenever we get that first hard frost in the fall. Next morning, I'm going to have to go out and I'm going to have to scrape off my car because all the leaves drop overnight. That kind of information would be very useful, I think, from a sweeping standpoint. Now, the public works folks would say, "Oh, it got down to 28 last night. We're going to sweep these streets here because they're all mapped out in GIS or whatever." So that type of coordination, I think, would be really critical, and I think that's really challenging to get because I think public works. I'm not sure of this. I think you would know more about it than me, but I think historically, public works folks and water quality for folks and forestry folks haven't always communicated real well with each other. And so I think we need to start thinking about this as more of a system, um, and so that we can kind of find that those inflection points you were talking about. When's the best time to sweep?
Yeah, it seems no question that that should happen. And I certainly recommend that stormwater departments combine into the same budget with the sweeping departments. Um, when Roger and Sutherland and I did a series of seminars in Northern and Southern California, and mostly to stormwater professionals. And we did a survey ahead of our presentation about how often they swept and the importance of sweeping and so forth. We got done giving them the facts, and the average was that they were going to go back and double their sweeping at least because now they had this information. So how do you transmit the information and the budget for that too? Because so often I think cities say, oh yes, pollution is very important to us, and here's what we're doing this and this and this. And when you say how often you sweep, well, sweeping's expensive, and it's whatever our budget allows. Another thing that I fault the University of Florida study with is that they did not differentiate between broom sweepers and air sweepers. And air sweepers certainly will pick up a lot more fines. There's unfortunately not a great technology out there in the sweeping world for handling just leaves. There are some dedicated leaf removal technologies that all work better, but sweepers can do a pretty good job with that uh, as well. So that's the challenge, I think, is to get the stormwater professionals and the public works directors and the urban foresters and the sweeping community all on the same page and understanding the importance of sweeping from an environmental aspect. We're sweeping for water quality here, and water is, well, they said 30 years ago, water would be the new oil. We just have to wait for it. Well, it's here now, and we've all seen that water quality is a big issue as well as just getting enough water itself. So,
Yeah, and I think folks like myself who have worked in the water quality world need to kind of expand our horizons too. We need to, you had mentioned about sweeping every couple of weeks, for example. Well, even that might not be the right way to do it. Maybe our public works folks just don't sweep at all during the summer or sweep once, and then all of a sudden in the fall they got to get out there every 3 or 4 days. So building flexible systems, into these public works programs. Um, and so people like me need to sit down with public works people and say, well, what can we do, and show them the data, and then ask them, well, what can you do to to address these types of issues. And so it's a lot of communication. It's a lot of bringing people from different aspects into this. And when we develop our guidance, for example, it really needs to also include those other components about what do public works folks, what's their contribution to it, and how do we reach them. So it's not a simple thing like, well, here we've got the data, just go out and sweep,
right.
So
Well, 30 years ago, one of the things that happened very routinely was that when a big rainstorm was coming, cities would say, oh, well, now I don't have to sweep because it's all going to just get washed down the drain. well, if you have a combined sewer system or not, that's where it really makes the difference. But if you don't have a way to separate that out, now we know that you need to get out there with your sweeper ahead of the rain incident and get those pollutants off the street if that's important to you.
Yeah, and phosphorus, which is really important in Minnesota, is it's a very complicated thing. Street sweeping takes phosphorus off the streets, so that's one benefit. And we've been talking about that, but it also keeps phosphorus out of your other practices that are downstream. And ponds, for example, we're seeing ponds not perform the way we would like them to perform. And I think personally a big reason for that is because a lot of our constructed stormwater ponds are getting loaded up with organic material. And if they get that organic material into the pond, then it eventually it's going to be re-released as dissolved phosphorus. And so um, street sweeping gets phosphorus off, but it also protects your downstream practices too, which are very expensive, as you pointed out earlier. Keep them as efficient as you can, make them last as long as you possibly can by doing things on the front end. Another area that I'm going to start trying to do some digging into, for example, is um, residential lawn leaf management. We've been talking about street sweeping, but here in Minnesota, we think a lot of phosphorus comes off in the wintertime too, and we think a lot of that's coming off of residential lawns. So can private citizens do a better job of managing their phosphorus too? So it's really a complicated problem and has many elements to it.
Well, I think the a real key is to find incentives that work for these cities. And if you have a stormwater permit and you're not in compliance, and you develop a way that you know what the sweeping program can do, and you know what the end of the pipe stuff can do too, and you're able to get credits. I mean, so in Minnesota now, as an example, and in Florida, we know that to remove, and Florida talked about nitrogen and phosphorus and um, just particulate matter, PM. And the sweeping did a better job by far, by orders of magnitude, than the end of the pipe solutions for all of that. And particulate matter is also very important because that's the sediment that washes off the streets. And now that, out here in Washington, we need spawning beds, for example, for the fish. And I bet that's the same in Minnesota and in many other areas. And if you get the silt that washes off the street, and the smaller stuff is easier to transport, then by sweeping, you're going to remove a lot of that too before it can go down the drain. My point here is that how do we get the information to these professionals around the country so that if they have stormwater permits and they're trying to do the best job they can under them, they're able to know how often to sweep, and as you say, with the guidance, know what kind of sweepers they can use that will do the best jobs, and that's our challenge at the moment.
Yeah, and this communication plan that we've been working on here has multiple elements to it. Um, and we're not sure exactly what the best ways to reach people are. We're going to try a few different things. We're going to try webcasts. We're going to try workshops. We're going to try surveys, year-to-year surveys. Have you done this and that? I think one of the best ways of reaching people, though, and getting the message to them is through case studies. So we really need to focus on those cities that have looked at this credit and said, yep, we're going to do it. And then work with them to track the information, and then hopefully the results will be very good. And people will see that, hey, this city, which changed its street sweeping habits, is all of a sudden getting a really large credit for phosphorus from the agency. Well, I want that same credit, so I'm going to go out and start doing the same thing. So it's kind of a leading through examples kind of thing. And I think all those other tools are good, but when you've got real tangible results that people see and they say, I want those same results, then I think that's when, I think, for example, back when we started recycling, way back, we did curbside recycling. There'd be 2 people on my street that would put their recycling out every year. Then there were 3, then there were 4. And, at first it was so-and-so is putting their recycling out. And then after about 3 or 4 years, it was so-and-so is not putting their recycling out. And so I think that's ultimately the best way of communicating, is saying, we're getting good results here. You want the same results? Here's what you got to do.
I couldn't agree more with that, Mike. And uh, then our next challenge is they're getting those results. And if you're picking up X number of pounds of material, and that has X amount of phosphorus in it, has X amount of nitrogen, or whatever you're trying to handle as a pollutant. The next question is, how much of that did you pick up? Are you requiring those cars get to be moved? And that's been one of the real challenges, is vehicle removal, so that you can get to the curb and get the material. And unfortunately, the same spots tend to be covered up each time, because, as you say, with recycling, it's the same people aren't putting their recycling out. Well, it's the same people aren't moving their cars. So under those vehicles, now the leaves are sitting, they're rotting, they're oozing from water flow and so forth. And it's so important to move the vehicles. And I think you'll be able to see by the case studies in the areas where people are aware the municipalities are requiring vehicle removal, that's just so much better. Um,
And
it,
that's the beauty of a mass-driven approach that we've got, is the more material you pick up, the bigger the credit you have. Well, if you want to pick up material, you got to get the cars off the streets. And so I think
yeah,
hopefully cities will make that connection, that we have to do this and this and this too, so that we can maximize the amount of material that we're collecting.
and with newer technologies, there's no reason that apps can't be used that would enter in with the city's uh, street database, and that has all the resident addresses and so forth, and allow them to log in and not have to. A key will be when we can not make them move their car for 4 hours, we can make them move their car um, when the sweeper goes by, and that'll be okay. And if we start using cameras on the front of sweepers to give the tickets, that's huge. If we can start getting an app that says, hey, the sweeper's a mile away, and then have the app give you another notice that says, hey, the sweeper went by your address, now it's safe to put your vehicle back in place. That'll be huge, because right now there's a lot of pushback from citizenry to have to move their cars for 4 hours, and I get it.
Yeah, and I think when we develop this guidance for sweeping, we have to look beyond the traditional guidance, which is based on the science, um, and look at some other things like you've talked about. Well, there are other issues to this, getting cars off the street. That's not something that researchers, we don't research those types of things. We just see, well, what's being collected and what's the relationship to phosphorus. And so things like that, I mean, are there apps out there? Are there GIS systems out there? And that should all be pulled into the guidance too, for cities, to help them understand um, what the best ways are to collect this material. I don't want to change subjects too much here, but I want to back up just a little bit um, on the phosphorus thing, and I want to get this point out because it's really, really important. Um, Not all phosphorus is equal. We have phosphorus that's attached to particles, and we have phosphorus that's dissolved in the water. And the phosphorus that's dissolved in the water has been shown to be about 5 times more bioavailable than the phosphorus that's attached to the leaves. And what's the biggest source of dissolved phosphorus? It's phosphorus that's being leached out of leaves. So historically, I mentioned I worked in the world of TMDLs, total maximum daily loads. Those have always been written in terms of total phosphorus. All our water quality goals are in terms of total phosphorus. And so people have been going after particulate phosphorus for years. And unfortunately, it's kind of misguided. People should really be going after dissolved phosphorus. And street sweeping is, if not the most effective, it's certainly one of the most effective ways of getting that dissolved phosphorus, which is 5 times more bioavailable, getting it off the streets. So it's not just I'm picking up a molecule of phosphorus. It's I'm picking up a molecule that's going to end up as dissolved phosphorus. So I'm sorry if I diverted a little bit there, but that's a point I'm just trying to drive home over and over and over to people is it's really about this. If phosphorus is your main target, dissolved phosphorus is what you're after.
So how do you go after that better? That's something that I'm not familiar with. How does that work?
Yeah, it's the organic material. You want to get that organic material off the system. Uh, Animal waste, dog waste, leaves. Those have a lot of easily um, leachable phosphorus in them, and so that phosphorus come in. Studies show that if you want to get the leaves, you want to get the leaves as soon as they drop as you can before the rain. And that's because when it rains, you're gonna get 50% of that phosphorus out of the leaf, right? Almost right away.
Mhm.
So get that leaf as early as you can. You're gonna get that dissolved phosphorus out of your system. So it's all about getting the organic material. If you don't, and you send that phosphorus to a bioretention system, now you've got to put in iron or aluminum or something like that to extract the dissolved phosphorus. So you have to special design your system, which drives the cost of building that bioretention system up. Iron enhanced sand filters, maybe you've heard of those types of systems.
Yeah. Hmm.
We're putting iron in them because they won't take out the dissolved phosphorus unless they've got that iron in them. Why not take the dissolved phosphorus out when it's in the street?
Right. That makes so much sense. And simplistically, then, uh, if we have been sweeping for cosmetic reasons, and you'd be amazed at how much sweeping frequency goes on, or specific sweeping because somebody has the cell phone of the mayor or the city councilman, they complain about what's on their street, so they send sweepers out there, or do that more often, and so forth. But so if we have a certain amount of sweeping being done for cosmetic reasons, and there's a minimum frequency that needs to be done for cosmetic purposes, and slip and fall and that kind of thing too, as pebbles build up and food waste builds up. But now we need to really look at the weather patterns and the leaf drop, and maximize getting out there using that data. And it seems clear that should be included now, given the work done in Minnesota, in any sweeping programs scheduling, so that they can, when the leaves are most likely to fall, they're going to be out there on top of it right away.
Yeah, if you were to go to the Minnesota Stormwater Manual and you went to the street sweeping page, and say you were in the manual and you typed in street sweeping, you would go to a page that deals with that. And I'm pretty sure I have a picture way up in the upper right that I took off my street the day before they were going to sweep. And if you look closely, you can say no parking because they're going to be doing street sweeping. And below the caption says, "Why are they sweeping this street? I could eat off of it. There's nothing in the street." Um, and that's just because it was that time of the year to sweep the streets. So when you say cosmetics, even that, I'm asking myself, well, what's even the cosmetic benefit of this? Um, so leaves, they're not just a source of phosphorus, but they also block your sewer system so that you get flooding, and they don't look very nice after a rain, and they turn to mush. So sweeping the leaves up when they're in the street is not just necessarily about phosphorus, but that's a cosmetic reason in my mind too, and it keeps the sewer system flowing too.
Hmm.
So I think sweeping at the right time isn't just a water quality issue. It's multiple issues.
Hmm. Yeah, no question. Well, what else? What else should we cover here that we haven't covered? I think this has been a good freewheeling, go back and forth, and I think will answer some questions for stormwater professionals as well as sweeping professionals, public
Well,
works.
I think from my perspective, and I'm always trying to reach out to people who are smarter than me, which isn't hard for me to do. Um, any way that we can work with folks, anybody to help give us information that is useful to help guide, public works folks. You had mentioned some of these apps earlier. That's stuff that we need to get into our guidance, and we need to get that word out. So we can develop the communication plan, but is the information that we're delivering, is it as complete as it can be? Is there some information that we're missing?
Mhm.
So we need to bring the right people to the table. And one of the things I've tried to do with the Minnesota Stormwater Manual is to encourage people, send me emails, send me research articles, send me uh, non-research articles that have interesting information, send me case studies. The more information we can gather and learn about this, the more we can actually, because when we're out talking to people and doing workshops, we want to give them as much good information as we can. So
Mhm.
um, I, everybody should be talking to everybody, and so that's one point that I think is really important. Is that if I could add to our conversation is, let's develop a community of a communication network where we all start to communicate about the best ways to sweep and why we're going to sweep the way we are and so forth. And
Mhm. Yeah, and any of the other, I mean, we're talking about sweeping here, but what are the other technologies that can make a difference? And we want to know that too. And what is their place and what's the hierarchy? What's the pecking order in how this could be done? And unfortunately, it's more of an art than a science, and has been for a long time. So how can we make this into more of a scientific process, at least to start, where you say science tells us that we should do this, 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 and this, and then collect our results and see what how we should now modify our program. But
yeah, and
go
in the world we work in, I think, and I work in a agency that does regulates. We have NPDES stormwater permits. I work in the guidance world, but I work directly with the people who do the permitting and review the permitting. And we've unfortunately I shouldn't use the word backward, but we kind of have done things backwards. We know that stormwater contributes to water quality impairment, so then we go out and we develop rules, the Clean Water Act, and we require permits. And then 10, 20 years later, we find out we start doing a whole bunch of stuff to try to meet our permits. And then 10, 20, 30 years later, we find out, well, maybe we shouldn't have done it that way. We should have done it this way instead. Well, it's unfortunate that things happen that way sometimes, but that doesn't mean that that's that's fine. We learn lessons as we go along, and that doesn't mean we can't change. So, the sweeping has been done. I'm not going to say for the wrong reasons, but it hasn't necessarily been done for water quality purposes
right.
the way it should have. That doesn't mean we can't start now, and we shouldn't start now. Um, so yeah, we've learned some lessons, and we should always keep learning lessons, I think. And uh,
Absolutely.
we're
Yeah,
not gonna we're not gonna get it right the first time. So
sure. And when it comes to water quality, even though it says world sweeper behind me, if there are other technologies out there, whatever they are, that should be added in, and however they should be added in, we want to do that, and we want to, as you say, uh, find those ways. There's a company that and named Rubicon that is big in the garbage business and tracking and so forth, and they tell me that they have a capability of having the cameras that can give tickets, that their technology in terms of GPS allows them to know when if it's mounted on a sweeper, if it goes away from the curb and then back into the curb. By looking at that, we can tell how much material was left compared to the amount of area that was swept. However, they're so busy right now on the garbage side of things that I'm having trouble getting their attention on the sweeping side. So um, if there's a competitor to Rubicon out there, you might give me a call because they're very busy and they're apparently doing a real good job. So we need somebody else doing that too.
Yeah, and we live in a world where people have to make money, and so um, another thing I'd mentioned this earlier. Another thing we're after is well, how do we manage residential lawn yard waste? And if people put it out in their curb and we had curbside collection, for example, is that a good way of dealing with residential lawn leaf management? Um, and obviously, a business who did the collection, there's money to be made in that for them. And so, yeah, there's a lot of people we need to be talking to and bringing to the table, I
Well,
think.
and then the next one, I think parking lots that has not been addressed. And some parking lots are swept, almost every night. Others are not swept and they just allow the material to run off into the streets. So I think that the next thing we've got to look at is that there are some states and cities that are uh, now requiring a pretty hefty fee, can be $1,000 a month and more for impervious surface area runoff with malls and other business properties. Well, if that is swept 5 nights a week, 7 nights a week, there's really not much that they can run off. So should they be exempt from those taxes? And that's something to look at somewhere.
Yeah, and even though I work in a regulatory program, I'm much more of a carrot person than a stick person. And I think providing incentives to people, we're going to give you a credit if you do this, as opposed to a penalty. And penalties maybe eventually at some point, if you're a bad player, yeah, maybe that's when. But let's try to incentivize people to do things on the front end. And in Minnesota, we know we've got the land of 10,000 lakes, and we value our lakes, and so that's the tool that we often use with people is, you go, do you like to swim? Do you like to fish? Do you like to jet ski or water ski? Um, what do you think of your lake water quality? And oh, it's green in the summer. Well, public the public has a part to play in all this too. They'll contribute to um, budgets. They'll pay more through their trying to think of the word here, that that cities collect dollars to keep the streets maintained, and maybe it might be willing to pay a couple extra bucks a year more because they see the connection to the.
Right. Yeah. They need to see the connection. And now with the internet, there's no reason that you can't educate people about that and put signage on your sweepers talking about the environmentalism of it. Put modules into your classes. Fifth, sixth grade, get started on them, doing poster work and educational work and so forth to learn about the values of water quality, and they'll grow up and
Mhm.
carry that forward. That's an important part.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency, and I don't want to rag on people too much, but I think there's a tendency to think, oh, the sweeper is going to come along and it's going to take care of all that. Well, that's true to some extent, but let's help them out. Let's do what we can to help them out as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, is there anything we've missed? This might be a natural quitting point. We're at about an hour with our conversation. Is there anything further you'd like to add? I'll certainly have all your contact information at the end of this and mine. And if people want to contact us at World Sweeper, we'll be glad to help any way we can, provide resources and links to studies and so forth. And I know you're in the same category with that, Mike. Is there anything else you want to wrap this up with?
No, it's been a great conversation. I enjoyed talking to folks about water quality issues, and because it's near and dear to my heart. And I'm a technical person by background and training, and so like I said, the science is easy. Now the tough part is getting folks to do things, and so anything we can learn to help get people to start doing things, that's the next step, I think.
I do too. So that's an excellent place to leave it. We've been speaking with Mike Trojan. from the Minnesota Pollution Authority, and I didn't get that quite right. What from the
Minnesota Pollution Control Agency.
control agency? There we go. And he has 30 years of experience dedicated to this. Don't hesitate to give their office a call. They have all kinds of links, and we'll have some of them available to you as part of this story. Thanks a lot, Mike, for taking the time out to handle this with me.
No, thank you very much for the invite. It's been a great conversation, and I love talking water quality to people.
I know it's been thought-provoking on my end, and I'm flattered that it has been on your end too. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.